We are in part 3 and certainly hope you've listened to the first 2 so that you're ready for this one. A question which comes up very frequently is, how do we know we have what was written in the Wayback Time? Well, that's an excellent question. And it isn't nearly as easy an answer as was given to me all my life in the what I call now the magical thinking theory, that things were written down, copied pristinely, and delivered to us to this very day. In fact, we are still discovering older manuscripts and bits of manuscripts. And just as important, we're discovering other manuscripts that teach us better what the words meant that they used, what the context were that they used these words in. And it gives us better shades of meaning. In fact, that means, are you ready? And here's where a lot of you are going to turn off or fire off angry emails. It's okay. I'm a big old fella. I can handle it. Our Bible translations today are far better than King James, the American Standard Version of 1901, the Old Revised Standard Version. They're much better. Now, I'm not talking about paraphrases here, like the Message or the Story, the New Living Translation. Those are paraphrases, and they have their place. They have great value, but they're not translations. I'm talking about translations. The New Revised Standard Version, the New American Standard Version, the Contemporary English Version, pretty good. English Standard Version, okay. The NIV of 2011, really good. There are so many good versions. And you might want to, if you don't already, have a Bible app that has a few dozen of these already on there so that you can go back and forth and check. But you can also get parallel Bibles. They're more expensive. They're print, and they'll have 3 to, I've seen as many as 6 translations side by side. They can be a little expensive, but they're very handy to have. And I've actually bought one. I'm sorry, that was not true. Our Safe Harbor has bought one for an inmate on death row in Louisiana so that he can compare and talk to people. But they're better than the older versions. You know why? We keep finding better, older manuscripts. And I assume we will continue to do so. Now, that tells us a couple of things, but one of the first things it tells us is you don't have to have perfect manuscripts and a perfect Bible to find Jesus and be loved by God, because we have been loved by God in the Christian faith for 2,000 years, and we're still perfecting our translations. So it's all about Jesus, not about our perfection. Let me tell you a story, and this is really vaulting from where we were last week into the future, all right? But then we're going to come back and take a look more step by step where you got that Bible of yours, all right? Here we're going to go way back into the 1800s. And we're going to meet a guy named Konstantin von Tischendorf. There will not be a spelling test later, but there is a biography of him up on Amazon. The hardcover is like $200, and it's only a 200-page thing. The Kindle of it's like $32. So I'd recommend that you try to find some online sources that you could just, if you want to know a little bit more about him. He was traveling with a camel caravan across the deserts of North Africa when he came to the walls of this amazing old monastery called St. Catherine's. Now, the monks in this monastery took their vows of solitude and prayer very, very seriously, to the point where visitors were not welcome. It was very rare that somebody who didn't belong in that monastery got to visit the monastery. And getting into it, well, first of all, getting to it was very difficult, especially in the 1800s. Well, there are no supply routes, really. If you don't bring it, you don't have it. And this camel caravan is passing by, and he sees it now. He wants to get in there. Why? Well, he's a linguist, and a brilliant linguist. And he wants to see, what Bibles do they have? What scripture? He wouldn't have said Bibles. He would have said, what scriptures do they have? What books do they have in there? He had already, at this age, he was only 29. He had already mastered several ancient languages. And he had this desire to clean up our Bibles. And this is in the 1840s now. To clean up our Bibles, because even by then it was so obvious, and it had been obvious ever since, I'm going to say, about the year 800, that the manuscripts we had often clashed with each other. Some of them were very poorly translated. Augustine, for example, never really cared for Greek, and therefore his work was translated from Greek into Latin, and therefore he got a lot of stuff wrong because he didn't want to learn the Greek. Well, Tischendorf knew Greek and Aramaic and Hebrew and Syriac and several other languages already. And so he was looking around, can we find older manuscripts that are closer to what was originally written than what we have back in the 1800s? For example, the King James Version was really a redo of other Bibles that were already around. And those Bibles had already had corruptions in them. Still, I must state that the perfection of the Bible is not the issue for our salvation. All we're trying to do is get the Bible more accurate as to what they wrote. Not just individuals, but also the editors. What did they write? What was supposed to be passed down to us? Now, the walls of St. Catherine were over 30 feet high for protection, because there were marauding bands of tribal peoples. There were also incoming Islamic pressure and attacks. There were also the vagaries of local rulers who would sometimes decide, oh, I just want to go and sack that town or take everything they own. And so they were protective. They had built these walls up high, and the only way to get there was to be raised up by ropes. They would lower these ropes, and you're hauled over and up and around. Now today, actually, they have a little bit easier access. It's not much, but it's a little bit easier. But the problem is, once again, there have been a lot of attacks on Christians in that area in the last, especially 50 or so years. And so travel is generally not advised unless you're doing so in a good group that has security. So this is still a very remote place. Finally, they're hauling him up. Now, he didn't expect to find a treasure trove there. He was on a journey. Now, the books he wrote about the journey, those are much more easily available on Amazon, maybe in your bookstore. If you can buy local, get them to order it for you, pay a few extra dollars and keep the bookstore alive. But the books he wrote are very available. And the first book I was talking about is a biography of him. Those are hard to come by and they're expensive. So that said, this guy was just looking for more. He'd already published a Greek New Testament in 1841. He was 29 years old. You don't get brains like this very often, but you got one in Tischendorf. But he'd been frustrated because as he made his translation, he had to keep deciding, well, is this manuscript correct or is this one correct? This Bible seems to disagree with all the old manuscripts I have, but this one seems to agree with so he's trying to coalesce them all, put them together, and then make the right decisions. But he was so frustrated by the corruptions, poor quality, and the late date, which means copies of copies of copies of copies. Many of them would have holes in them or ellipses, which are missing pieces within the page. So he had set himself this task. I'm going to visit all the great libraries of the Middle East, all of them, and Europe too. And I'm going to make copies of everything I find. And then I'm going to compare all of them to try to figure out which is the oldest, truest word choice in every single instance. And there are many thousands of instances where that needed and still needs to be sorted. He started in Paris with a manuscript nobody had ever been able to decipher. It wasn't written in a secret code. It was called the Ephraim manuscript. I find that amusing, you'll find out why in a moment. This was a copy of the Bible, the Old and the New Testaments. It was made in the 400s. by an ancient scribe. Oh my goodness, you have hit the mother lode now. 400s? That is so much older than any of the manuscripts that have been used for the bishop's Bible, the Erasmus's work. Well, not so much his. Later on, the King James Version, all the other. This is so much older. The problem is, a guy named Ephraim, told you I'd tell you, was a minister, a preacher, and he wrote his sermons on top of the manuscript. Now, this was not as bizarre as it sounds. Papyrus, paper, vellum, all these things were incredibly expensive. In fact, the book of Romans probably cost about $30,000 to $40,000 in materials. That's why books were taken by someone and read to the people. They weren't just passed around at the market square. So when you had paper, you wrote. And so people wrote, palimpsest. Sometimes they would write over this way, and then turn, and then they write over it the other direction. But because of this, the manuscript was completely unreadable, except to Tischendorf, who had incredible eyesight. Now today, by the way, we can verify that he got this right. And because we've got all kinds of lighting tools and tech to reveal what's written underneath and different inks and such. With his eyes, he saw it. He made an accurate copy of it and astounded the scholars of the day. It reminiscent of Jesus in the temple, blowing away everybody by his knowledge of the law. Tischendorf had blown away the scholars. They're looking at it going, he got it. This is amazing. And of course, the excitement was just through the roof. A manuscript from the 400s, Old and New Testament. This is amazing. Well, it brought him so much fame that he was now fully funded to make these trips all over Europe and then into the Middle East and North Africa to uncover as many manuscripts as were absolutely anything available and anything forgotten books or the like. And by the way, another book, much more available, much easier to find, Kindle or hard copy. Paperback is what I have. Sisters of Sinai. Sisters of Sinai. So, Sinai Mountain, Sisters of. These two sisters, unmarried, they got to St. Catherine's too. And they taught themselves languages so that they could read the books that they found. Amazing. Okay, back to him. Tischendorf went to Egypt, Sinai, Palestine, Patmos, Constantinople, today Istanbul. He chronicled his journey in a book called Travels in the East. That book is readily available. You can buy used or new copies or Kindle copies anywhere. He knew going into the East was very, very dangerous, as it was. People were robbed and killed and kidnapped and enslaved. Slavery was a huge thing in the Middle East and North Africa at the time. But he had a noble purpose. He wanted to find any books. If they were old, great. If they had been forgotten, great. But somehow the more you find, the better, the more confidence you can have that our Bibles are actually accurate. At St. Catherine's, he was given a small room, an apartment, some people call it. It's just a room. And told he could have access to any books in the library. And this is when he started finding out some really sad things. Most of the monks never read the books. Most of the monks couldn't read the books. They were either illiterate or they didn't know the languages. They didn't consider them important. In fact, the librarian brought Tischendorf a big basket of manuscripts at one time, saying, these are useless. They were all in very, very poor condition. He said, these are of no value, and we've been using them as kindling for our fires in the monastery. Just going to let you sit there with that one for a bit. Picking them up and going through the basket, Tischendorf was astonished and appalled to find that some of these were books of the New Testament written in the oldest Greek he had ever seen. And he'd seen it all. And these were being tossed on fires or deemed useless and trash. So he called for all of the leaves. He said, bring them all to me. But the monks got very suspicious at this stage, wondering, are we being ripped off? They were suspicious of outsiders anyway. They gave him 43 sheets. That was 1/3 of the sheets. And they'd already been marked, useless, used for fires. His excitement over finding these sheets made the monks even more suspicious that he might steal their books, so they would not bring him anymore. He just begged them, don't burn any more of them. And he was sent away. He had 43 sheets, 1/3 of them, and he was sent away from the monastery. Well, he published his findings in Europe, but he wouldn't say where he got the ancient manuscripts, because once you do that, then the world and treasure hunters and rich people of the day would hunt down St. Catherine's, and people who didn't know what they had would take pieces away as souvenirs, holy relics. So 9 years later, he finally gets back to St. Catherine's for another try. And nobody knows where the other 2/3 of the leaves are. They'd forgotten that they were important. So he said, just bring me whatever you can find and I'll read it. One much more modern book had a bookmark that excited him. It was a portion of Greek New Testament scripture in the same handwriting as the 43 sheets he'd been given before. So whoever had written that bookmark was the person who had written those earlier manuscripts. That's about all he had. So he went back to Europe. He published what he had found in the 43 pages. And he also let them know that there were another 86 pages that had not been recovered. The Tsar of Russia, Alexander II, sent Tischendorf right back to St. Catherine's to see if he could find where the other leaves had gone. And so 15 years later, after the first trip, he went back and he was allowed to have access to the library. But it was a disheveled mess of rotting books, scrolls in pieces, water, not much water there, but when the rain comes, it would come in and despoil the manuscripts. And after a while, he became certain he would never find the rest of the manuscripts. At 45 years old, he was running out of time. 45 years old, after the life he had in the 1800s, he's an old man. On the 4th of February, 1859, he told his Bedouin caravanners, be ready to leave on the 7th. 3 days from now, I'm done. But he wasn't. That story next week. Tune in for another exciting story. I love this stuff, and we haven't even started with the old ancient stories of this. So I hope you're enjoying this. Again, we're just going to keep getting better and better at translating the Bible. So don't despair when you hear of a new translation. Always check out to see who did it, why did they do it? Because there are some translations that are done by, let's say, groups of people who have a particular religious viewpoint they want to push. So, general rule, and I'll do this and I got to quit because we're over time. General rule, when you look for a translation, look to see who is on the translating committees. That is available. Some of them even put it in the Bibles themselves in a foreword, but you can find it online very easily. What you're looking for is you want to make sure that as many varying viewpoints as possible were being considered. So when I look at a translation, I want to know that Roman Catholic, Orthodox, Baptist of 5 or 6 different stripes, that Presbyterians of 4 or 5 different stripes, Episcopalians, Anglicans, independent Christian church, Churches of Christ. I want to make sure that, Methodist, as many voices as possible. And of course, all of them with qualifications to be able to do the job. Had a say. The NIV is very much like that. Their New Revised Standard Version is very much like that. And of the modern versions readily available. Those are my two go-tos by a pretty far margin. But there are some smaller ones, such as, and I've told you that before, David Bentley Hart's New Testament, that never leaves my desk. There are other ones like that that you might want to have access to. I'm late. I'm sorry. I've kept you from your pudding. You guys have a great day. Write us, encourage us. If you can support us with $5 to 50 million, no, $5 or whatever, that would be a blessing. God bless you. We'll talk to you next week. Cheers.